Hello, void and all who inhabit it. It's me. And according to social media, if you're a woman pushing 30, you need to be drafting that last will and testament, beloved. I'm admittedly much more of a TV guy than a cinephile, but in an effort to expand my internal media library and make the most out of this little AMC A-list subscription not sponsored, I've been pushing myself to watch more films. Movie hype is still pretty hit or miss for me. I'm routinely unimpressed by however many millimeters were involved in the production of a project, but every now and then, all the raga surrounding a film lures me into a matinee weekday screening. The Substance was one such film. A satirical body horror, The Substance follows Elizabeth, a fading celebrity who, after being fired by her producer on her 50th birthday, uses a black market drug to create a younger version of herself with unexpected side effects. Released in September of this year, the film sparked several conversations. In the melange of discourse, however, one tweet really stuck out to me. The Substance, a hagsploitation sledgehammer, its unsubtleties a feature and not a bug. As a burgeoning spinster who frequently cackles, I was immediately transfixed by the idea of hagsploitation. As a note, I'm not taking Zhang's tweet as gospel, just crediting him as a launching pad for this most recent info spiral, wherein I tried to pinpoint the traits of a genre I'd never heard of prior. What is hagsploitation? Why would The Substance count as one? What other films are within the genre? How many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop? I had a lot of questions. But before combing through the genre and the specific films I watched to try and answer said questions, we first have to clear up some naming conventions. Hagsploitation is a term that's often used interchangeably with psychobiddy and grand dame guignol. In psychobiddy films, questioning the main character's sanity is integral to the plot. Regardless of how her sanity is worn down over the course of the film, these are psychological thrillers with a heavy gendered aspect, frequently through motherhood as a theme. Grand dame guignol, as defined by scholar Peter Shelley, is a subgenre in two parts. Part A is the grande dame, an older woman of great dignity and prestige. She is a cultural and literary archetype, usually portrayed as a flamboyant woman prone to extravagant and eccentric fashion. I think this role can exist within the hagsploitation film in question, be exemplified in the types of roles the lead actress would typically play at this point in her career, and or be reflected in our cultural connotations of the lead actress. Part B is the grand guignol, which is French, allegedly, for big puppet show, and specifically refers to a theater company founded in 1895 whose plays specialized in macabre shockers and showed graphic violence. These activities were used to explore themes of suffering, insanity, vengeance, and fear of the unknown. Altogether, Grand Dame Guignol is a label used for a morbid psychological thriller about an eccentric older woman, which arguably is how you could define hagsploitation, a subgenre which also often explores themes connected to motherhood. But I'm separating hagsploitation as films that are distinctly influenced by the pressure placed on women specifically because of age. As such, the definition I want to use also requires two parts. Part 1 is the hag, a woman overly invested in youth, whether her own or someone else's. Youth in this case does not just refer to beauty, but also reclaiming lost time. She can be played by an actress who has a long-standing cultural reputation, but it's important that the actress actually be an older woman. For example, I wouldn't count X, a slasher where Mia Goth plays a young woman named Maxine and an older woman named Pearl, because the older female character isn't played by an older actress. Another important aspect to the hag character is that we gain access to her point of view and that she has substantial narrative weight, either as the protagonist or antagonist. As a reminder, protagonist and antagonist does not mean hero and villain, but simply who has the goal and who is impeding it. For example, I would count Ma, a film about, quote, a group of teenagers terrorized by a lonely middle-aged woman, as a hagsploitation, because the titular character has a plan that we see several elements of while the teens act against it. Sue Ann, aka Ma, also initiates and drives a lot of the story, which I think is another way to think about this key aspect to the hag. As another example, I wouldn't count Late Night in Soho as a hagsploitation, despite what this Wikipedia page says, because the film is focused on the point of view of Ellie, a young college student, and the involvement of her older neighbor Miss Collins is a reveal. Compare this to Straitjacket, a film about a woman recently released from a 20-year sentence in a psychiatric hospital, wherein we question reality alongside Lucy, the recently released woman in question, and the involvement of her young daughter Carol is the reveal. Finally, the hag is someone whose story explores age as a horror to experience versus a horror to witness. The best way to explain this is to use yet another example. The Front Room, a recently released movie about a newly pregnant couple who are forced to take in an ailing, estranged stepmother, would not count as a hagsploitation. Not just because the focus of the film is more so on the psychological torture of Belinda, the young woman in the couple, but also because within the Rosemary's Baby of it all, the stepmother's age and what comes with all of that is presented as a horrific thing to the people around her, as opposed to a focus on how Solange, the stepmother, is processing aging being something horrific for her to experience. Now, the depth and care given to the perspective of said hag is a separate train of thought, but the key thing to note is that the introduction and exploration of the alleged hag's psyche is where our horror and story lies. That is separate from a film which simply places an aging woman as a horrific thing to navigate around. Part 2 is the exploitation. I've discussed exploitation as a film term before with blaxploitation, but the term generally refers to films looking to profit off of exploiting current trends or niche genres. There's a peak in exploitation films during the 70s, but we can see these subgenres pop up across time. When it comes to hagsploitation, what's being exploited? Given that this subgenre is one of the many that peaked in the late 60s and early 70s, these films were being produced against the backdrop of multiple social movements. Most importantly for hagsploitation is second-wave feminism. Although much of second-wave feminism's advocacy seemed more invested in younger women of a working age, there was budding feminist writing that considered the impacts of aging. Susan Sontag in 1972 conceptualized the idea of a double standard of aging. Lillian Rubin's research in 1979 would argue that aging into and past middle age offers women the opportunity to recover or discover for the first time their elusive selves and identities. Although their research was published in the 70s, I would argue that these discussions challenging how women are allowed or expected to age were occurring as second-wave feminism was building. Rubin's work focusing on women of a certain age easily connects to some of Friedan's discussions about finding worth outside of housework as explored in her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique. All of this is to say, we're at a point in time where women's place in society, specifically in an American context, was being interrogated. While second-wave feminism wasn't the best at being intersectional, some piece of this interrogation did consider how women's societal positioning was limited by age and the realities that contradicted expectations of futility. And at the same time, sexism still exists. So although we're starting to name what's going on, we're also operating within a cultural context that views women over 50, over 40 in the cases of some of these films, as past their prime utility. As such, discussing the perspectives of aging women, even while perhaps feeding into negative connotations, emerges as a cultural trend to tap into. Additionally, as these socio-political conversations are happening, many of the well-loved actresses from the golden age of Hollywood are approaching this terminal age range. Women like Joan Crawford, Bette Davis, and Elizabeth Taylor, whose public personas helped establish a standard of femininity, were aging out of that standard. This is also reflected in their ability to find work or lack thereof, with many lead actresses from hagsploitation films of the 70s having been in years-long hiatuses due to a lack of roles. To that end, some would argue that the lead actress herself and this specific wave of beloved starlets who'd vanished from the spotlight is what's being exploited. Very much come see the oddities type tease. While I agree that the appeal of a beloved starlet we haven't seen in a while is something that can be and was exploited, I want to move away from perceiving that influence through the grande dame archetype in my analysis. This is in large part because I think the grande dame isn't as prominent as an archetype anymore, but also because what I believe is more pertinent is that the lead actress is over 40 years old. Her cultural capital plays a part here, but more so than her reputation, what's being exploited are our ideas and cultural connotations around life after 40/50. With that in mind, I will admit that the height of hagsploitation, like many exploitation genres, is a product of its time. However, I want to examine how newer entries to the genre utilize the hag figure as sculpted by these older films to approach horrific examinations of aging through a gendered lens in a more contemporary mindset. a tainch bit more context before the analysis. I got my list of hag films from a couple of different articles, the aforementioned Wikipedia page, and my own brain as I aim to find a spread of films across the decades. On the screen are the 9 films I considered, but I really recommend checking out Peter Shelley's book for a list of films from the 60s to around the late 70s if you're interested in finding more. I've also split these films into 3 categories: the initial hagsploitation, aka the original recipe, Death Becomes Her, and contemporary entries. Death Becomes Her is its own category because it's a fairly strong comparison point to the substance, and it's the only 90s to 2000s film I could think of that fit, but if you have some ideas, please share them below. At the same time that I was building and watching through this list, I was also watching Agatha all along, and I kept thinking about Maiden Mother Crone. As a note, I'm looking at Maiden Mother Crone as separate from neo-paganism. I think there are, in an American context at least, these cultural categories of being for women based in age that Maiden Mother Crone really succinctly captures. Anyway, what I feel like is presented in older hagsploitation films is that failing as a mother begets haggery. Failing can be literal, often via being too overbearing, or just failing to appear motherly, failing to fit what you should quote unquote be at that age. As I moved through the list of films, haggery began to more broadly be initiated by way of refusing, rejecting, or again failing to do what's quote-unquote expected of you at a certain age. You're supposed to be a docile, demure older woman, and you're nothing of the sort. Interestingly, as I looked at more contemporary entries, there's another shift towards focusing on characters whose rejection of middle-age futility manifests as a desire to be perceived as a 20 or 30-year younger version of themselves. While it starts to look a little different over the decades, we can begin our unraveling of the genre with this, the hag's most consistent pursuit, the desire for youth. Across the decades, hagsploitation films have almost always carried the message that the person this woman was in the past is not the person she can continue to be, giving very much girl let it go. It makes sense then that this woman's journey to reclaim something she could never have is bound to be horrifying. But I think where these women end their stories also delivers a scare in a cautionary tale type of way. Starting with our original recipe batch of films, there's 2 entries in particular that introduce more interesting alternatives to just death as a warning. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the seminal text, follows an aging former child star, Jane, tormenting her paraplegic sister, a former film star named Blanche. Jane is the one in this dynamic who desperately wants to reclaim youth, and specifically, she wants to go back to a point in time, which is a desire that's fairly familiar in these older films. More than wanting to be young, a lot of these women want to go back to when life was good. The horror in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane comes in the disturbing things Jane is willing to do to get closer to who she was. By the end, Jane is in a deep state of delusion, arguably psychosis, but I'm not a doctor. But it's horrifying, it's heartbreaking, honestly. The cautionary tale of it all comes through the film ending with this suggestion that this woman is so sick, that's why she wanted this thing, and that's sad. Compare this to Straitjacket, which I mentioned earlier, but this film follows a woman who, having murdered her husband and his lover decades prior, didn't mention that before, is suspected of a series of axe murders following her release from a psychiatric hospital. As the first entry of the Joan Crawford multiverse of young women hating to see a mature lady winning, part of the horror in this film comes in our fear that Lucy, the main character, is going to strike again. We also see a few people getting their heads chopped off, which was truly shocking. But there's also the horror of recently released Lucy trying to reset the clock and be the same woman she was 20 years ago, who is not just someone more willing to Paul Bunyan a bitch to pieces, but also an inappropriate woman to behave as now at her big age. At the end of this film, once the true killer and their tricks are revealed, Lucy is suddenly extremely lucid and demure. floor. This woman falls into place with who she is quote-unquote supposed to be. This end message of "you can't do that" is being communicated often through pity.
Oh, it's so sad that you want that thing. You must be sick.
Austere redemption.
Oh, it's so good that you realize what you should want and how you should act.
Or, of course, death. A lot of these women do die for coveting the past. We skip forward in time and arrive at Death Becomes Her, a film which follows, quote, two women fighting for the affections of the same man. They drink a magic potion that promises eternal youth with surprising consequences. The explicit desire for youth, and more specifically a return to a former state of being, is presented in a much less trauma-connected way. I will note that Death Becomes Her is a comedy with body horror, more so, and not at all a psychological thriller, so we've got multiple subgenres in the studio with us this morning, but work with me here. In Death Becomes Her, there's a connection between youthful beauty and power. Even before we get to the magic potion, Mad, a failing Broadway star who meets up with her childhood friend Hell, is initially interested in Hell's husband Ernest because of his job as a plastic surgeon. The potential for Mad to cheat time, specifically at that point as a way to remain relevant, makes him appealing to her. It's very clearly this situation of,
I want this thing because it will give me power in certain scenarios.
The end message of the story is that
cheating nature is unnatural and bad.
But instead of leading to course correction like in Straitjacket, that revelation results in the women's downfall, literally. The character's situation is horrifying to themselves, but there's also a horrific moral that punishment is a result for one's pursuit of powerful beauty. Notably, in the last scene, Ernest is praised in his eulogy for understanding that true mortality comes from investing in the next generation. Your goal shouldn't be personal vanity, but perhaps literally having kids and your legacy living through them, which kind of connects back to the maiden mother crone of it all. But there's both a denouncing of Mad and Hell's quest for eternal youth, without a recognition of why beauty is power for them, and a promise of eternal suffering in a way for them. You didn't get the thing you want, you're stuck in this flawed, altered form, and you'll be unable to use it the way you intended. It is maybe at this point that it's worth noting how noxiously written by men all of this stuff is. Part of this is a statistic inevitability, albeit not a completely hopeless one. A fun anecdote about Ma is that it was written because Octavia Spencer approached her friend and said, I want to be in something really f***ed up, and that's what he came up with.
I got this backwards. Ma is actually very 1970s hagsploitation coded in its origin story, wherein somebody wanted to make something f***ed up and then reached out to an actress who hadn't had many lead roles as the lead for this f***ed up film. But I'm keeping this anecdote in here because I think it's interesting to see that dynamic continue.
But perhaps some of that earlier feminist theory we talked about isn't being digested so much as it's simply opening doors for different conversations and different audiences to target. The lack of hagsploitation films written by women is one of the many things that makes The Substance such an interesting entry to the list. While I think there can be heightened expectations for marginalized creators that leaves less room for grace, on the positive side, I think there's also a level of care and attention provided in perspective that's instrumental to storytelling. Similarly to Death Becomes Her, where the main character wants to stay relevant, the main character of The Substance wants to change how she looks to still be valuable. But The Substance does a better job of building out the environment that establishes Elizabeth's need to change. It's not just vanity, but working in an industry that runs on youthful beauty. I think it's also important that The Substance, as in the product, promises a better self, and for Elizabeth that is a younger self that takes the form of Sue. I did kind of bump up on the sci-fi mechanics because Elizabeth is repeatedly told that she and Sue are one, yet neither can recall what the other is doing when the other is in control of their shared conscious. So I had questions about how/if Elizabeth was living vicariously through Sue. Regardless, Sue does not just reflect enviable youth. Her existence is the embodiment of a pursuit of youth that comes at one's own detriment. Even while seeing the act of harm being done to her body, Elizabeth rejects initial opportunities to stop using the substance. Arguably, her refusal to stop is because of a satisfaction rooted in the attention this other version of herself can get. The horror comes in all of the complications that arise when she continues to use and abuse the substance. By the time Elizabeth not just realizes but comprehends the damage that is coming with this continued use, it's kinda too late for her. There's nowhere to go but down. The end message of this wild ride is one of self-love, for lack of a better term. Turning yourself inside out isn't worth it. And something too that I think is interesting is the infusion of comedy, of like allowing both in this film and Death Becomes Her to infuse some levity into the examination of something that can feel so stressful and crushing. While the substance continues in the generic tradition of pushing characters towards a recognition that a pursuit of youth comes at a great cost, one that's not really worth paying, Elizabeth's spiral happens in a unique state of solitude. Admittedly, I think there is a conversation to have about characters being more isolated in media post-lockdown in general, but Elizabeth's solitude is a stark difference to other hagsploitation movies. Rarely in these older films does the main female character exist in isolation. In the films that I watched, the driver's seat is the closest exception to this pattern. The conceit of that story is that the police have to piece together what happened to this missing woman by interviewing multiple strangers because she spent the day alone. We flip between the investigation and traversing Rome with Lise, the main character, comparing what actually happened to what the police are able to piece together. Although Lise is an explicitly lonely character, we're still able to watch her interact with others. Lise is treated as a receptacle for the desires of everyone she comes across, irrespective of age or gender. People make assumptions of her based on her appearance and then proceed without shame. Interestingly, every man she meets sees her as someone to violate, perhaps with the exception of Andy Warhol and that wig. But more importantly, we're given the opportunity to understand Lise in comparison to the other women she interacts with and how they all move through the world. Whether these are more modestly dressed, motherly older women or stylish, carefree younger women, we consistently get the messaging that Lise sticks out because she doesn't match, figuratively and literally. Also, for what it's worth, Lise isn't solely a receptacle for interpretation. She rejects or dismisses the older women who glob onto her and bemoans the behavior of the younger women. She willfully sticks out. And despite the fact that Lise spends her story fairly alone, the driver's seat continues in the vein of other hagsploitation films wherein women's interactions with each other are used as a way to explore competing ideals for womanhood or femininity. Often this is explored through an older woman viewing a younger woman as a competitor, unless again you're watching a Joan Crawford joint, in which case the younger woman is more likely to be the source of any issues, or the film will present a woman as living in a state of misery and wanting to add more people to it. The idea of competition and miserable company continues in Death Becomes Her, where the joke at the end is that Mad and Hell, as lifelong rivals, will only have each other as companions for eternity, if you ignore the whole legion of immortals. These images all dance around the idea of terminal spinsterhood, more Patty and Selma than Miss Abernathy, you feel me? It's actually kind of interesting to think of this contradicting message that failing to become a mother or wife leads to spinsterhood, and yet spinsters always have each other at the least. At any rate, Elizabeth's complete removal from society in the substance is a very stark turn. Arguably, her extreme isolation is part of the message. Elizabeth was easily consumed and more easily disposed of. That also falls in line with the critique the film is presenting of questioning an institution that doesn't put much care in women beyond chewing them up and spitting them out. But I found it really jarring that nobody, not even her agent, cares when Elizabeth disappears for weeks. Having Elizabeth remain confined really siphons off a lot of exploration of who she could be, currently is, and once was. Perhaps because she's almost always alone, Elizabeth mostly externalizes thoughts on her hatred of Sue. The film leans heavily on the competitive aspect of hagsploitation in this sense, but in a twisty-turny, internalized type of way. The woman Elizabeth is competing with is herself, or more specifically, an idea of herself made real. However, it's not just character development that's limited by this stark isolation. We get a truncated exploration of the system of consumption that is not only critiqued by this specific film, but is also at the heart of hagsploitation as a genre, one where personal worth is connected to how easily you can be consumed. in conjunction with consumption in hagsploitation is personal worth as exemplified through social cultural capital.
False.
I'm using social or social cultural capital here the same way that one would use financial capital, as in this is a resource that you can use to get things that you want, but I recognize that social and cultural capital are words that don't mean those things and that the way that I'm using them is not the way that they are meant to be used.
Do people remember you? Are you respected? Are you pitied? If you went missing in Rome, how much difficulty would the police have in tracking you down? How are you cared for, if at all? Hagsploitation often explores that question based on if this woman is still considered worthy, and what happens when you age out of the thing which brought you worth, and illustratively now people don't care about you. As The Substance is a film about a fading celebrity, it only makes sense to compare it to the film that sparked the whole subgenre, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. As a reminder, this film follows an aging former child star Jane tormenting her paraplegic sister, a former film star named Blanche. Notably, Jane has been forgotten by the sands of time, while Blanche continues to be a beloved actress who receives a revitalized wave of fans after some of her old movies start airing on TV at the start of the film. Jane and Blanche are our initial answers to the generic question, what happens when you age out of what brought you worth? For them, worth is based in fame. It's fairly easy to visually glean an understanding of how the sisters feel about the past and their current social capital. Jane is trying to regain power and money, and the only way she knows how is through the tap dance routine from when she was 7. The last time she was consumable enough to be profitable was when she was a little kid doing vaudeville routines. As such, her attempt to return leads to a physical change that is garish, childlike, and inappropriate. On the flip side, although Blanche hasn't acted in 20 years, she maintains a demure allure that's seemingly connected to her on-screen persona. If anything, she shifted to being desired as an elusive star, although I'd hazard a guess that Blanche would have only remained desired as so long as she kept to this polished persona. The twist at the end of the film opens up the potential to challenge our ideas of who we sympathize with, but the initial idea, the one that runs through the entire film, is that the well-adjusted sister whose persona remained beloved and easily consumed has more social capital and worth than the sister who stopped being entertaining once she hit puberty, and that lack of being desired for her entertainment value has deeply damaged Jane. For The Substance, the answer to what happens when you age out of the thing that brought you worth is similar with regards to the damage done by a loss of value. Elizabeth learns that she's considered washed up at 50, she invests in a way to access a more desirable body, and then spirals as she grows to hate that body and what it does to her own. She has a similar reaction as Jane in a zealous desire to reclaim youth as a means of regaining worth. Yet Elizabeth also has a similar allure as Blanche in being a star loved for decades. However, the social capital that Elizabeth has built evaporates as soon as she steps out of the studio. She crashes down from her pedestal with an impact that I would liken to a feather dropping onto a pillow. She don't make no noise. The fleeting glimpse of any lasting pull her social capital might have comes in the form of a man who's been coveting her since high school. I'm of two minds about this guy. On one hand, it's scathing to have a character's social cultural capital get boiled down to only having weight amongst a goofier version of Day One Harry Dubois. But on the other hand, it's a testament to this woman's social cultural capital that she's lingered in someone's mind for so long. It's a little diluted because this guy knows her from before she got on screen, but regardless, the longevity of Elizabeth's cultural image is brushed away quite quickly. Elizabeth's cultural image is also in large part dependent on the visual shortcut of casting Demi Moore. But within the narrative, the weight of Elizabeth's long-standing influence in the collective memory is so ephemeral and loses impact again almost immediately. If this woman was in the minds and hearts of many for years, I think we should have some exploration of the toll that has on her, beyond I've lost value because I'm no longer attractive and I have to get that value back. We don't get a good grip on how Elizabeth is viewed beyond being an object,
And yet,
that's very much the point. The fact that this woman evaporates from public consciousness is very much the point. We are focused on how she is viewed and how these limited external opinions have impacted her sense of self to the point at which she can't think or care about anything else. It's very direct, but it's also a bit repetitive in my opinion. A tangent, if you would indulge me for just a moment. I think the best scene in this film, i.e. when Elizabeth struggles to get ready to go out for drinks with Harry Dubois Jr., is so impactful because it's one of the few times we are shown Elizabeth as someone who is more than a vessel for objectification, willingly or otherwise. We get some externalization of how she sees herself now as a 50-year-old woman by the way she struggles to even try to connect with another person once she's been removed from her carefully constructed position as someone to covet. She can't perform a familiar role anymore, so who is she now? We don't get to see that deeper unraveling of Elizabeth much. Instead, the film focuses a lot on her self-loathing via her hatred of Sue. If anything, and to the film's credit, the narrative spends a bit more time poking at the system by doing this than it pokes at Elizabeth's damaged sense of self, albeit in a similarly repetitive way. Honestly, the repetition of a pretty simple message is what makes the claims that this movie was misogynistic and objectifying so bonkers to me. The scope is so narrowly focused on critiquing the system of beauty as currency that the film low-key strips away any exploration of anything else. And I say that very neutrally, but I do wonder, how do you miss the point when that's the only thing being said? Let's take this tangent a little bit further, walk with me. So Slave Play, Stay With Me Babe, is a 2018 play by Jeremy O. Harris. It follows 3 interracial couples going through some kink-based race-centric therapy. The specifics aren't important here. What is important is that during the last act of the play, which is all one scene, a character is assaulted by her partner. And as this assault is happening, the backdrop curtains on the stage part and reveal a mirror. The audience then has to watch their own reaction in conjunction with what's happening on stage. I think The Substance, in a more tasteful matter, is doing something similar when it comes to its exploration of objectification and how women's bodies are presented in media. The film is presenting us with something really gratuitous and demanding that we reflect on our reactions to it. Specifically with regards to Sue, everything from egregious camera angles to Mr. Jumbo Shrimp as a character, to Sue not even being able to speak, but because she smiles, the shareholders are happy in the end, is holding up a mirror and telling us to look at the damage done by this cultural standard of beauty as currency, of consumability as worth. Look at how unsustainable and dehumanizing it is. Look at who profits from it. Look at how much you enjoy it. And if that's not obvious enough, there is a whole scene where the final form of Elizabeth and Sue's meddling with nature, poor sweet monstro Eliza-Sue, stands on a stage and an audience is forced to look at her, excuse me. But returning to this question, what happens when you age out of the thing that brought you worth? The answer doesn't often move beyond resentment of an aging body and the coveting of a younger one.
I'm a girl.
Notably, The Substance does go further to provide a decent amount of ew at the older body, which makes sense given this film is a body horror. There has to be something to be grossed out about beyond Miss Girl's spine cracking like a McRib. But when thinking about what viewpoints we as the audience are being asked to question, I'm not as confident that The Substance is as strongly pushing us to challenge how we look at older bodies. I do think The Substance is encouraging, especially women over 50, to find self-worth and value outside of a system that'll push them to destroy themselves, which is more than I think any other hagsploitation film has done beyond providing a level of shame, judgment, or outright disgust. But it's interesting to me that the horrific, monstrous body is so rarely a young one, like an Other Mother situation, but she's trying to upsell you on a Pilates class, girl, I don't know. I'll give The Substance credit that there are moments of horrific decay with Sue. However, the older woman's body is still presented primarily as something to be disgusted by or to laugh at. When Elizabeth suddenly gets the strength of a great typhoon and despite having aged rapidly can drag her tether through the apartment like a chew toy, many people in the theater I was watching this in laughed because it's so fucking absurd. And also, like, it's a black comedy, girl, you can laugh. But most of Sue's body horror moments interrupt scenes where the camera is ogling her. She's about to hook up with this guy and she gets a violent nosebleed. She's dancing at work and a bone pops out. We have these moments of visually devouring her that are shattered by shock horror. I think at least a narrative equivalent for Elizabeth would have been something like her finger necrosis popping up while she's trying to get another gig. As much as one could argue that the presentation of Elizabeth's old body can reflect her negative self-image, it also becomes an oddity in and of itself that's almost separate from Elizabeth. And arguably all of this goes back to my mirror tangent. If you laughed at Elizabeth cosplaying a fairy tale kitchen witch, maybe you missed the point that this lonely and vengeful version of self is actually terrifying. But the energy given to challenging our propensity to be barking at the screen, foaming at the mouth for a young tight body, the ability to set us up with a familiar image and then disturb our expectation, isn't as potent when it comes to reevaluating how we view aging bodies. And mind you, older hagsploitation films struggle or fail to explore this as well. It's just that their disgust is explored more narratively than visually, which I think we see through the common three endings for older women: dead, pitied, or redeemed. In the decades since the initial hagsploitation film, and with various infusions from other genres, one trait remains at the center. You either die a hag or live long enough to become a crone. The options have remained fairly limited, but the morals have shifted and become a bit more compelling. Additionally, in contemporary films, we also get a hag who is more accepting of her fate and whose story exists with the potential to consider something more. I think this is best and perhaps unintentionally presented at the end of Death Becomes Her.
Is one man who will indeed live forever.
Blah, 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 blah.
Eternal melting aside, there's a message to pull that you cannot return to a version of yourself that was easier to swallow. You'll be sharp and strange and burn all the way down. And maybe that's not a bad thing.
It's been argued that hagsploitation is an innately insulting term. I don't disagree. The moniker is definitely an intentional choice meant to deride women of a certain age, and as such, I think any analysis of these films should question if the narrative is laughing at the lead actress or laughing with her. But I also think it's kind of a circular comment to explore because we're talking about films within a subgenre that hinges on less than favorable expectations, be they cultural or literary, of women over 40. So without spending time questioning if the potentially offensive term is meant to offend,
we can dive into what to reap from these films. Is the story or the visuals or both setting up familiar dynamics and shattering them or reinforcing them? Can we apply a theoretical lens that allows us to pull from the sinews of story some shifted idea towards aging and beauty, intentional or otherwise? Can we cult classic this thing into something that feels more affirming? Some of these films are rough to examine, but others in the genre, especially as we move forward, are providing some reevaluation of our perceptions around aging, even if it's primarily by way of unsettling us as the viewers.
Mind you, that doesn't make these films free from criticism. The intentions of the substance, for example, are very clear and effective, but I also think that being provocative won over exploring some of what's presented a bit deeper. However, that imbalance is perhaps just as foundational to the genre as the hag herself. The key to examining our opinions on aging, to go further and challenge our over-reliance on beauty, is perhaps simply to witness the refusal of expectations.
Whilst I was writing this, Halle Berry was quoted in an interview as saying she's longed for someone to say something to her other than "you're so pretty." In the same clip, she's discussing her desire to be a spokesperson for aging gracefully, and she says that unrealistic expectations can turn women into monsters. And I was like, did you just watch The Substance, girl? I didn't watch the whole thing, so that would be actually very funny if that's literally what they were talking about. But I found this idea of wanting to age in a way that doesn't overly fit on an ideal so timely for two reasons. Firstly, the lily white elephant in the room. This subgenre and many of the films that fall within it are whiter than freshly fallen snow. Arguably, that's the most second-wave feminism thing about this subgenre, but my point is that it's not lost on me that the standard of beauty being built up, weaponized, and deconstructed is one specifically tailored by and for white women. Ma, as the lone entry of color to the hags list, isn't a strong contender for applying the intersection of race to this pursuit of youth. The best, and I use this word lightly, we get is a scene where Sue Ann coats the black teenager's face with white paint and says there can only be one of us. But although hagsploitation films are 8.5 by 11, or A4 for my international listeners, kind of white, The pressure of maintaining a flawless, ageless level of beauty is pervasive. Secondly, this interview popped up as I was initially trying to process thoughts around the dissonance of having a character with low self-esteem be played by a famously gorgeous woman. Kind of like in the Barbie movie when Barbie's crying about not being perfect or pretty enough. I can't remember which one. And the narrator breaks the fourth wall to say, maybe don't cast Margot Robbie if you want this to be an effective line. Now, I know pretty people have problems too, and there's also undoubtedly a different kind of stress that comes with the expectation that you'll always show up looking gorgeous. But I liked Halle Berry's interview shining a light on how reductive it ultimately is to view a woman as only being beautiful. What's complimentary is inevitably isolating, even if we perceive it to be a good, positive, reinforcing thing. It's just detrimental. There's so much more. The multiplicity of man is so much more than just if your face is symmetrical, you know? There's also something positive to be said for having famously gorgeous women be at the forefront of aging, from the gracefully realistic to the fantastically horrific. These women can shift from being points of comparison to being someone a viewer can maybe more easily connect with. Hagsploitation itself has always provided the potential to see beloved stars contend with the great equalizer, time. Regardless of how it's done, perhaps providing the space to openly discuss the aging process is enough to encourage major milestones to feel less daunting because they're being tackled together, or at least being framed as fucking bananas. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. If you're watching early on Patreon, thank you for your support. Have you seen any of these films? Did you watch The Substance in theaters? Did you cover your eyes, girl? I know you did, and that's okay, I'm not judging you. Since watching Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, I'm seeing it everywhere now. Kind of ridiculous. I also meant to watch Sunset Boulevard because apparently that low-key sometimes gets counted. I just want to watch it because I heard it's cuckoo bananas as well. I know I slipped a lot of critique of The Substance within this video. I also don't know if I'm going to keep the line where I said that within the video or not, but I genuinely do hope that that movie inspires a lot more examinations of aging and beauty in ways that like allow women to be wacky, unhinged, unsettling, but again, like does a little bit more than just I am an object, how do I process being? Girl, we don't have to go into it. We can go into it on the Patreon, where if you're interested in what I'm watching, you can follow me for free on Letterboxd, where I've been tracking all of the movies that I'm watching, or you can come join the $5 tier on Patreon, where every month I do a recap of everything that I watched in the month prior. When it comes to hagsploitation specifically though, I had an idea for a hagsploitation version of The Truman Show meets Landscape with Invisible Hand, where there's a drive to switch the main character out of the show that she's not aware she's in because she's gotten quote unquote too old. And the realization of her soundstage reality is paired with her learning that aliens think she's too old based off of their own understanding of human standards. I don't know, it's messy, girl, but hey, if somebody's looking for a script, you can go ahead and take that idea. Because something, I couldn't like put my mind around this, but going back to the whole like men of it all, there's like something so not pretentious, like demeaning to have a man be like, women are so vapid for caring about their beauty and like you just need to lean into being Mother Goose, without like a recognition of why women care so much about their beauty, which again, I think The Substance does do, but I don't think it does much more than that. And honestly, girl, maybe that's for the best, because even with it only doing one thing, respectfully, people still didn't pick up what was being laid down. Anyway, I'm just repeating myself at this point. I have mush mouth like a motherfucker. Editing this is not going to be fun, but I'm traveling for the holidays, so we gonna have to make it do what it do, baby. Speaking of, it's the end of the year. Wow, sorry, still talking, girl. I'm giving WhatsApp audio message, giving you very much Patreon tease. Happy holidays, happy new year. I hope that you're staying safe and surrounded by love, however that may show up for you. I will be back in February. I'm very excited for the next video. Already got it planned out. Who is she? She not me. So until February, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.